Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for the Community College National Legislative Summit. I'm Carrie Warwick-Smith. I am the Vice President, Public Policy at the Association of Community College Trustees, and I'm joined by several colleagues who I will introduce in a moment. But we are thrilled to have so many of you joining us today to prepare for your trip here to Washington, which is now less than 2 weeks away. So with that, I will ask for the next slide. Today, I have joining me David Boehm, Senior Vice President, Government Relations with the American Association of Community Colleges, Jose Miranda, Director, Government Relations with the Association of Community College Trustees, Jim Hermes, Associate Vice President, Government Relations, AACC, and Rosario Duran, Senior Government Relations Associate with ACCT. And we are all going to go through various bullet points on the green sheet today, which is now live on our website. I know we've had a lot of folks reach out about it, and we're very excited to be able to share it, and the backgrounders will be following very soon so that everyone can do their homework on the way to town and be ready for their meetings. Next up, I'll just quickly go over the agenda before we dive into the content. So we're going to start with navigating the 118th Congress. As I'm sure many of you saw in the news, it got off to a historic and what some may call exciting or maybe nerve-wracking start. We'll talk about how that impacts the advocacy work and the topics that we selected for the green sheet. Then we'll do the overview of the green sheet, a question and answer session, and some reminders. And if any of you might be new to the Community College National Legislative Summit and find yourself saying, what is the green sheet? The green sheet is the one-pager of top legislative priorities that we ask our colleges to share with their members of Congress to let them know what community colleges are hoping that they work on. They are derived from the 118th legislative agenda. That's the joint legislative agenda, which is passed and approved by the boards of both AACC and ACCT. That is a very long document. You will see it in brochure format at the event. And that really encompasses everything that Congress could possibly work on over the next 2 years that at least we could, that we have been tracking and could think of. Whereas the green sheet is designed more to be a point in time document aligned to what we think Congress might work on in the few months following the legislative summit. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David, who's going to kick us off talking about navigating the 118th Congress. David?
Carrie, I'm actually going to take this one first before David, and I'll let David go on the second slide.
Okay, great.
Hello, everyone. As Carrie said, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in just under 2 weeks here in Washington, D.C. So before we get started with the legislative priorities, we want to set the groundwork, set some context, give you the lay of the land, because this is a very different Congress than what we've seen in certainly the last 2 years, definitely the last 4 years. So as a result of the 2022 elections, we have seen some changes in who's in control, who's in power here in Washington, D.C. The House of Representatives changed majorities from Republican to Democrats. In a turn of irony, they actually have the same difference in terms of members as they did last Congress, but in roles reversed. So Republicans now have 222 representatives. Democrats have 213. What this means is that we now have Speaker McCarthy in charge, and we will see a change in leadership in all committees from Democratic to Republican. On the Senate side, things look a little different in that from the House, in that Democrats retained the majority, and in fact, they were able to flip a seat from Pennsylvania to now have an outright majority. If you'll recall, during the last Congress, the Senate was in a 50-50 split. Democrats and Republicans each had 50 seats. And the only reason why Democrats were in the majority was because they had the tie-breaking vote of the Vice President Harris. With now they're controlling a 51-49 edge, that means that committees will likely not have an even split of members, which means it'll be easier for Democrats to move things out of committee, whether those are nominations or specific bills that they're trying to move. And the vice president will no longer be needed to break the tie in anything that happens. Last Congress, the Senate had to go through special discharge procedures to move things out of committee. That will no longer be the case. One quick thing to note is that Senator Sinema, after the elections from Arizona, switched party affiliations and she declared herself an independent. But for our purposes, it's still the same thing because she's still planning to caucus with the Democrats, which means Democrats will still retain a 51-41 majority. What this all means is that we now have a divided Congress and a divided government. We're not going to see major pieces of legislation moving as we saw in the 117th Congress. We're certainly not going to see the big time levels of federal investments that we saw last year, particularly around COVID relief, infrastructure, and STEM and microchip investments. So the House, which is now controlled by the Republican Party, will probably focus a lot on oversight and bring accountability to the government. You will hear a lot about Secretary Cardona, Secretary Walsh, folks from the White House being called to testify in different hearings. I think my colleague David here mentioned this recently. He said, we expect Chairwoman Fox to keep us very busy with everything she plans to review in terms of actions that have occurred during the Biden administration. In the Senate, because there isn't a lot of prospects in terms of moving legislation, we probably are going to see a lot in terms of moving presidential nominations, whether that's judicial nominations or for various other agencies. With the fact that there is now a divided Congress and nothing other than what must absolutely pass is very likely going to pass and become law, we can expect the president to become more active in what Kerry has called pen and paper. When we've had conversations, we're going to see potentially a lot more executive actions, a lot more unilateral moves from the administration and from various agencies. So that's just setting the context for what you're going to see when you come here to DC. I'm going to turn it over to David now to talk a little about what these changes mean within the chambers of Congress.
Thank you, Jose. And yeah, building on what you just heard about the broader composition of Congress this year and the change in party control in the House of Representatives, we're just drilling down a little bit and being a little bit more focused on the individual committees that will have jurisdiction over most of the legislation that is of the greatest importance to our students and our institutions. And there have been some extremely important changes that have occurred both because of the party flip in the House, as well as some just movement otherwise in the Senate. First of all, in the Senate Help Committee, Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who I'm sure all of you or almost all of you are familiar with, is going to become chair of the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. The ranking member is Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, who served on that committee since he came to the Senate and is fairly deeply versed in a variety of policy issues. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, has not focused so much on legislative achievement and enactment of bills is the general perception about him. He has, however, been a strong supporter of some major proposals that would have a very positive impact on our sector, including a bill that would make college free for all public school higher education students who come from families of incomes of $125,000 or less. So he's on record in that regard. The other members of the Senate Help Committee have not been appointed yet. The Senate has taken a little longer than anticipated to organize. So we're going to have to wait at least a couple more days before we know who the full roster is going to be of that key health committee. Also in the Senate, the leadership on the Senate Appropriations Committee, which of course controls the power of the purse, the 12 appropriations bills, has changed. Senator Patty Murray, who I'm sure also listeners are familiar with, from the state of Washington, former community college faculty member, and just a huge supporter of our students and our campuses. She will become chair of the extremely powerful Appropriations Committee in the Senate. And then Susan Collins from Maine, again, most of you, I imagine, are familiar with her, more of a moderate senator in terms of her political philosophy, is going to become the ranking Republican member. And that's in contrast to Senator Patrick Leahy and the Democrat from Vermont who retired, former chair, and Senator Richard Shelby from Alabama, who's also retired. So moving over to the House, the Education and now Workforce Committee, renamed that by the Republicans, will be chaired by the former chair, Dr. Virginia Fox from North Carolina. She's also a familiar figure to many of us because she's been very active and very deeply immersed and productive in producing legislation in previous Congresses. And we expect that that will be no different in the current 118th Congress. The ranking member of the Education and Workforce Committee will be Bobby Scott, who was the chairman since 2018 for the last two Congresses. When the Democrats retook the House, he'll go on to be the ranking member. Getting back to Fox just for a moment, I just would say that we do expect her to be quite active in higher education, both in an oversight mode and probably giving a tough scrutiny to a variety of actions by the Biden administration, as well as moving legislation itself, including in all likelihood a Higher Education Act reauthorization bill, or one that includes many provisions impacting the Higher Education Act, as well potentially as WIOA legislation and apprenticeship legislation. So we'll be very busy. One thing I just mentioned to outline a little bit about the political dynamics that we're walking into, and this is something that I know most of you know, is that when you have a Republican-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate, the odds of compromise on bills that might be signed into law then by President Biden drops dramatically from when there's single-party control of government, as there was for the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And so we're not sure exactly how our agenda will be moving through Congress. There may not be a tremendous amount achieved, but one thing that we always keep in mind is the fact that regardless of whether bills actually are signed into law, that it is essential to keep members of Congress aware of our issues, our priorities, our needs, the kinds of bills that we support, because you never know when they're going to move. And then related to that, Congress always has a strong interest in getting at least something done for the voters. So moving on to the House Appropriations Committee, again with the party control changing, the ranking member and the chair of that's Kate Granger from Texas and Rose DeLauro from Connecticut. Representative DeLauro has been a big community college supporter. The Labor, Health, and Human Service and Education Subcommittee will be chaired by Representative Adderholt from Alabama, who's a fiscal conservative. I'll have a very different approach to what we've seen in the last couple of Congresses. Representative DeLauro will remain in the ranking role. So that's a little bit about some of the key players that we're going to be working with. There are some others we don't have time to go into today on the tax writing committees and commerce and science committees, but those are some of the big changes that we've seen.
Thank you, David. Before Rosario transitions us into impact on NLS advocacy, it appears we had a bit of a hiccup on our website. We very much thought the green sheet was already there. So we are working on that, and we will post the link in the Q&A as soon as we've got that sorted out. But anyone who registered for the webinar will also receive the link and the slides afterwards. So we have a lot of questions coming in. I wanted to address that really quickly, and let me turn it back to Rosario now. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. So in addition to members retiring and, getting a new slate of freshman members, there's also, this Congress is also the first Congress elected with the 2020 census district maps. And what that means is that even if your member of Congress hasn't necessarily changed and you don't have a new representative, your college may have been drawn out of the previous district. So we are encouraging everyone to ensure that that their institutions are still in the same district, or to make sure that they get familiar with who the representatives are in case that has shifted for them. And to do this, we're encouraging everyone to go to our website. Under the Advocacy tab, we have an action center, and if you put in your institution's address, it'll show you your federal representatives as well as allow you to message them. So highly encourage that you check that out. Also, I think something that everyone's going to be very excited about is that both the House and the Senate office buildings are now open to the public. So you'll no longer be needing an escort, a staff to escort you into the building or to your meetings. So feel free to take advantage of that. And if you have several meetings or meeting up with other colleagues, you'll be able to move around freely within the office buildings. We do want to preface that the Capitol, however, is still restricted to only business meetings. So you'll only be allowed in the Capitol building if you have a meeting scheduled there. If not, you won't be allowed to access that. So also, we do want to emphasize that although the House office building and the Senate office building are open to the public, each office has their own rules and is abiding by their own rules. So if whether your meeting is in person or virtual is going to be determined by your particular office. However, we do expect the majority of those to be in person. We also want to just make you all aware that since the buildings are both opening up after almost 2 years of 2 to 3 years of being closed to the public, we do expect the lines to be rather long, as a lot of folks are coming back to the Hill that haven't been around in a while, and it's open to the general public, so anybody can be coming in for a visit. So we want you to make sure you're there with enough time to go through the security lines. And we also do want to note that there has been some staffing issues with the Capitol Police. So, they're not as staffed up as they used to be. So expect longer delays when going through the security process. And I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Rosario, and thanks everyone for being with us today. Turning now to the contents of the green sheet itself, and as Carrie mentioned, we'll get that link out to you as soon as we have it for the sheet. But the first topic on there is bolstering the role of community colleges in workforce development, and that is, as you can see here, largely a two-pronged ask of Congress. They both relate to the Workforce and Innovation and Opportunity Act, which, as you probably are familiar with, is the piece of legislation that does a number of things that directly impact our institutions. The Title I of WIOA is the what we think of as the workforce training system, the federal workforce development system, including the streams of money that go down to local areas to fund one-stop centers, the America's Job Centers, the workforce development boards at the local and the state levels, and the training funds that come with that apparatus. Title II of WIOA is the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, and as you all know, we have many community colleges involved in that program, both again at the state and local level as well. So this is one area where we think we do have a decent possibility of moving something forward, reaching some sort of bipartisan agreement and potentially moving legislation forward this year. We are certain that Representative Fox in the House Education and Workforce Committee will endeavor to move a bill forward, and we we'll just have to see how far they can make progress with that legislation. But we are continue to call should that bill move forward, and as it does, we continue to call on Congress to strengthen the role of community colleges in that workforce development system, including making our colleges much more partners in the system than many feel that they are now. That would include guaranteed places in the governance of the system, those state and local boards that I mentioned a second ago. That would ideally include streamlined or automatic participation or inclusion of community college programs on the eligible training provider list, which is essentially the list of programs that WIOA participants are able to choose from in using their training vouchers. And a number of other improvements to increase the prominence of training that happens within that system, as opposed to funding the apparatus of the system itself. And then the second prong in this area is to authorize a major community college-led job training program. That is essentially what would be a follow-up to the TACT program, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Training Grants program that we had several years ago. That was a major size, about $500 million a year for the 4 years that program existed. We want to see something like that in place again, both authorized and funded. And we'll talk about the funding in a couple of minutes. But we'd like to get that authorized as well. And that would most likely take place within a WIOA reauthorization. One possibility for doing that, and probably the leading possibility at this point, is to authorize a program that actually exists right now. That is the Strengthening Community College Training Grants Program, which was most recently funded at $65 million in FY23. So we would want to see that incorporated into WIOA, authorized, as I said, and with an authorized funding level of something far higher than the current $65 million funding level. The other possibility is, and other work is going on in Congress to renew the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act. And of course, the TACT program comes within that program as well. So that's another avenue to possibly authorizing a major community college-led job training program, namely reauthorizing the TACT program itself. So there are possibilities out there for how to do that, but we want to get something kind of written into law. So that's what we're looking at in terms of workforce. I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie now to talk about the next item on the sheet.
Thanks so much, Jim. I've just flagging, in case anyone didn't see Jose's chat, that if you go to nls.acct.org and then click the legislative priorities button, that is right by the register button on the main screen of nls.acct.org, you will be able to download the green sheet form. So I hope everyone can get that. And if anyone's having difficulty, please just keep putting it in the chat. We want to make sure that it's working for everyone. All right, so moving into the next section, looking at appropriations items, I would say this list is kind of the bread and butter of our appropriations ask, that programs that we include as top priorities in our requests each year around access and success, under-resourced institutions, and job training. So for under-resourced institutions or the SIP programs, we're looking at SIP, as well as minority serving institutions, the Title IIIA, strengthening institutions, strengthening historically Black colleges and universities, HSIs, tribal colleges, and others with traditionally underrepresented populations. For those of you following SIP in particular, 2 cycles ago, we were disappointed that we only had about $1 million increase. That increase was much larger this second time around. And so we want to just keep highlighting the importance of the continued support in these programs. And similarly, on the institution side, we also want to keep highlighting the importance of the job training and career and technical education programs. Those are areas that have had some attention that we would like to continue working on as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to move it over to Jose to talk about the DREAM Act.
Sorry, hit the wrong button. Thank you, Carrie. And just a quick recap here on the DREAM Act. So as you all may know, this is one of our probably perennial items in the Green Sheet. We've been a longstanding supporters of ensuring that Dreamers and DACA recipients have a pathway to citizenship. And we've had quite the number of false starts on this arena. The latest one being at the end of last year, where there was conversations around a bipartisan group of senators who were looking to make a move on this and figure out if there was a consensus agreement on a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers and a couple of other immigration issues. That all fizzled out, and with the end of the Congress, all those efforts died. Realistically speaking, we don't foresee any major movements in this arena, especially given the divided nature of Congress, with Republicans in charge of one chamber and Democrats in charge of the other. But we do want to include it because there are some timely issues around the DREAM Act, namely around the challenges on the judicial side that have come for DACA, and these are challenges that have that preceded the Biden administration, but that have slowly moved through the courts. And the latest developments here is that both the lower courts and the appellate courts had ruled against the program because they found, and they ruled, let me clarify, against the Obama era memorandum that established DACA. They found that the Obama administration, one, probably exerted their authority, and two, did not follow the procedural the procedures that they needed to do in order to establish such a program. That case has now been sent back to the lower court because during the first 2 years of the Biden administration went through the regulatory process to protect DACA. They essentially left the program as is or as it was, but they made it through the regulatory process where they allow for comments and everything, and they released their final rule last year. So now, with that being in play, the appellate court sent the case back to the lower court to then make a ruling on the new Biden regulation around DACA. Like I said, the program itself has remained the same. So the lower court could potentially find that the Biden administration went through the regulatory process the way they had to, but the program is still beyond their authority. Or they could just rule on the procedural part of it. It's really unknown what they're going to do. But what this means is that if the courts ultimately decide to rule against the DACA program, that might be one motivator or one factor that could get this Congress to act on Dreamers and on DACA recipients. So we wanted to keep it there. We wanted to ensure that folks know and understand and remember that these people are still in limbo, and many of DACA recipients are in our institutions. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Jose. I'm going to review a number of issues that are contained under the Higher Education Act, in all likelihood, probably as part of a reauthorization effort that we expect to see in the House of Representatives. The Senate action in this area is a little bit less likely. Having said that, we have been able to move a number of higher education provisions through appropriations bills and other vehicles in recent years. That includes the FAFSA simplification, as well as the Second Chance Pell Grant for Prisoner Education Program. So these are all issues that from our perspective are live. At the top of our list is the issue of workforce Pell. That is synonymous with the establishment of eligibility for programs that are less than 600 clock hours or its equivalent in length, which is about 2/3 of an academic year. As many of you know, those programs currently are not eligible for Title IV although they, in many cases, provide great career opportunities and upward mobility for our students, many of whom unfortunately are prevented from enrolling them because of a lack of means. So we've been advocating for a number of years now to try to get new eligibility established for these shorter term programs, both credit programs and non-credit programs. We've reached, we have not gotten this done, as I mentioned. There have been a couple of hang-ups and conflicts related to this legislation, very strongly held points of view about this, which is a little bit ironic given the fact that the amount of money that would be spent on this, by all estimates, is a very small fraction, just a couple few percent of the entire Pell Grant program at most. Actually, the official estimate is more like 1% of the Pell Grant program. But a couple issues that have divided Congress are what types of eligibility standards should be applied to these programs. Members do believe that there should be more rigorous outcomes standards attached to these programs than all the other Title IV programs, which, with the exception of gainful employment programs, basically don't exist if the program is accredited. So we don't like it, but that's the environment that we're advocating in. And we've been working and will continue to work with staff and members to try to find a solution that satisfies them in terms of making sure what in their minds are quality programs only being funded. Secondly, there's a big divide between the parties for the most part over the issue of for-profit institutions. Republicans, particularly in the House, and Dr. Virginia Fox, our new committee chair, is adamantly supportive of the for-profit colleges being eligible for new eligibility. Democrats are just as adamantly opposed to it. How they reconcile that, or whether it can be reconciled, remains to be seen. So that's a little bit about what we're working for on Workforce Pell, but this is very high on our priority list, as we know it is for you. The next item is concerns just the basic needs of our students. A lot of research and just campus experience shows that the current Title IV programs don't necessarily provide sufficient funding to meet all the needs of students. Congress has come up with a variety of approaches, and there have been additional proposals to try to fill some of the gaps that the current student aid system provides. A small program has been created that provides basic needs grants to institutions. They were just awarded last week. 8 out of those 14 went to our institutions, so we're very pleased with that. We'll be pushing, however, not only for more funding for that program, but also to expand SNAP eligibility in ways that make that essential food and nutrition assistance program more readily available to our students. The next item relates to the student loan programs. We could spend a lot of time talking about student loans. The Biden administration's loan cancellation and just announced new income-driven repayment plan. But this item on our agenda is a narrow one, and it's on this slide, as you can see, it says that we're interested in promoting responsible borrowing. What that translates into is our position that half-time students should only be eligible for half of the loan amount, depending on what year they're in. There should be the same relationship between enrollment and loan eligibility in the direct loan program as there is for the Pell Grant program, where in the Pell Grant program, you're only taking half a full course load, you only get half of the maximum Pell Grant. We think that that will be result in more manageable borrowing for our students. And then finally, the issue I want to mention and raise with you is the issue of transparency, accountability, and really what we know about the students in our post-secondary institutions across all sectors and what we don't know. And amazingly enough, to many of us, there still is no comprehensive data system that tracks students across and through institutions and into the workforce. And so anytime policymakers want to try to apply accountability measures or just know how the institutions are performing overall, they don't have good data on how individual students have done at institutions, because the only institutions that can be tracked with great specificity are on an individual student basis, of course, with privacy protections, are students who receive Title IV aid, and only about 50%, slightly more than that, of our students receives through aid. So when a policy like gainful employment is advanced, some of you may know that it's a regulatory initiative, but it is driven by the earnings of students and relates to the earnings of students and the debt they take on. There's an entire half of our student population that is excluded. We think that this frankly is madness. We think that it is extraordinarily poor policy to invest well over $100 billion in the student aid programs and not have a system that allows the government as well as institutions to track students and monitor the progress of students through their institutions and into other institutions, then on into the workforce. And we're trying to change that. There's some significant resistance to this. Again, Dr. Fox in the House is strongly opposed to this policy, primarily for reasons of privacy and a conviction that the government should not be gathering information of this nature on all students. One of the ironies from our point of view is that the government doesn't collect intimate financial information and other information about students who receive Title IV aid, not to mention what people provide through the tax code. So we're hoping that this legislation can be enacted in this Congress. Again, we will have to persuade Dr. Fox about the acceptability of this, but we do believe that it's very much needed to make our system function more efficiently for really all stakeholders. And I should add before we move on, Rosario is going to talk next about tax, is that this is to many people a bipartisan issue, and the Transparency Act that would create the system I'm speaking about is supported by both Democrats and Republicans in both chambers and has been co-sponsored by members of both parties in both chambers. So it's not a partisan issue as some other issues are in Congress.
Thanks, David. So this next section focuses on student tax policies, the main one being the Tax-Free Pell Grant Act. As many of you remember, we pushed very hard for this legislation last year when it was included in the Build Back Better Act. Unfortunately, it did not make it past the finish line, but the legislation would have ended the taxation of the Pell Grant and as well as altered the American Opportunity Tax Credit so that the Pell Grant awards were no longer subtracted from students' eligible expenses, all of which would have allowed students, depending on this aid, to keep a bit more of their much needed aid, as well as just create a more equitable distribution of the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And although this piece of legislation has not yet been officially reintroduced, we continue to support these policies, and we're going to continue to be tracking them through the 118th Congress and ensure that we're pushing for them. And next up is Jim.
Thanks, Rosario. And the final item on the green sheet is a new one for those of you who are veterans of the NLS, and that is the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is a wide ranging piece of legislation, probably best known for its things such as crop supports and of course also the nutrition programs, which I'll talk about in just a second as it relates to college students. The Farm Bill is up for reauthorization at the end of this fiscal year, fiscal year 23. And as a reminder, the federal fiscal year started on October 1st and go through the following September 30th. So we are in the midst of fiscal year 23 right now, and as well as calendar year 23. And so for the reason, the fact that this is such a major piece of legislation, it does enjoy bipartisan support because of the fact that it impacts the wide number of areas that it impacts so significantly, that we do think that this is one, and not just us, but many people think this is one area or one spot where we think we can see congressional action. That is not to say that there are certainly not going to be disagreements along the way on particular policies within the bill, but this will probably be one of them. So as you can see on the slide here, we're looking at two areas in terms of Farm Bill reauthorization as it impacts our colleges and students. And the first one is through either the creation or expansion or alteration of some of the programs at the Department of Agriculture, and that's the department that administers the programs within the Farm Bill. We'd like to see a lot more support for rural community colleges within the Farm Bill. Our colleges do get support now through the Department of Agriculture through a couple of different programs, but it is fairly limited and it is much more limited when compared to what the four-year colleges and universities get through their extension services and other things that they do. So we want to really expand support for community colleges in terms of grants through the Farm Bill. The second item, as you see here, is to increase access to SNAP, this supplemental nutritional assistance program, what used to be called food stamps, and make it easier for college students to access that program. As we all know, we have a lot of students with a lot of basic needs, including food insecurity, and SNAP is a primary way that the federal government addresses that. College students are eligible now in normal eligibility through participation in a number of different programs, including federal work study and others. There's been streamlined eligibility for college students since for most of the pandemic to make it easier for them to access that. And the main difference there being that college students can get SNAP if they are simply eligible for federal work study, or they have an expected family contribution of 0. If either of those applies to a college student right now, that also qualifies them for SNAP. So we want to see some sort of streamlined eligibility for college students extend beyond the pandemic national emergency, because those things I just mentioned, will only last as long as that national emergency lasts. So we really want to see that streamlined eligibility persist beyond that time and become a permanent fixture of the SNAP legislation. So with that, that's the contents of the green sheet, and I will turn it back to Carrie, I think, who will guide us through questions and answers. If you have a question, please type it into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to get to them.
Thanks so much, Jim. I see a couple of questions coming in already. I will ask you to use the question and answer function. I'm trying to see the questions in the chat, but there's a lot of hyperlinks and requests for the green sheet and other things in there. So if you have content questions, please stick them in the Q&A area, and we're going to start off on the access and success support on doubling the Pell Grant and a question of, is that doubling from the 6,900? And I think most, we don't put an exact number on it, but most of the double campaign Pell campaign materials are targeting about $13,000 in the end, because that would close the gap for Pell eligible students on affordability. So, the double is the slogan, but as we make some of these strides towards double, we have to remember kind of where we started, since the doubling will be incremental. So let me see, do any of my colleagues have anything else they'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Carrie. I mean, I think, the Pell movement has been in place for some time now. So it does actually predate even that increase that brought the Pell up to $68.95. So 13,000 is basically the number that people are talking about as the end goal of that initiative.
Thanks, Jim. Jose, I comment on the slide deck and available materials.
Yeah, sure. So as you all may have seen, the session is being recorded. We will have the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck up on the NLS website probably by Friday of this week. We just have to make sure that the video gets processed and everything, but we'll have the slide deck available to you all by the end of this week on nls.acct.org.
Thank you, Jose. Next up, could you go over the borrowing issue and the related position? Anyone volunteering for loans?
Yeah, I'll mention that and or go over that again. And that is, it's fairly straightforward, which is that under the current rules for loan eligibility, once a student becomes eligible for a loan, regardless of their course load and number of credits they're taking, they can qualify for whatever total eligibility applies to the academic year that they're in. So if a student is enrolled half-time and as a freshman, they can borrow the maximum amount under at that of $4,500. And even if they're only taking 2 courses, we would like to change that and have that loan maximum amount prorated relative to the student's enrollment intensity, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the same policy that is applied to the Pell Grant program. Let me just add really quickly, and if that's not clear, please put the question back in the Q&A, that we had not taken formal positions on either the Biden loan cancellation proposals, which of course are now in the courts, nor have we taken one on the income-driven repayment regulations that I referred to briefly. These are executive branch actions. They've been taken unilaterally and will be taken unilaterally by the Biden administration. So it's not a congressional issue. And we know that our students will benefit from both of those policies. I just mentioned quickly that the income-driven repayment notice of proposed rulemaking, the comments are due in a couple of weeks, would limit the repayment period for students who borrow $12,000 or less to 10 years. And the vast majority of community college students who do borrow don't take out that much in loans. And so they will have a shorter repayment period than they would have otherwise. And that's one, that'll be a big benefit to our students, assuming the regulation is finalized as the Biden administration has proposed it.
Thank you, David. Next up, are there any concerns, criticisms that we should be prepared to address with members of Congress, even if they are not a direct priority? For example, questions from members of Congress about critical race theory. That's certainly a hot topic. I think the first thing I would throw out is hearing as we, especially with the Republican majority coming in the House, a shifting attitude about spending less. So you might hear, oh yes, of course we support that program, but there just isn't any money available to it. And let me throw it to my colleagues for other kind of hot topic, current event type issues that members of Congress may bring up with attendees, even if they're not specifically on our priorities sheet.
I would just generally, especially given the example, say like just stay above the cultural war issues, particularly around CRT. It's being widely used. It's being widely used to cover a lot of different things that are not necessarily CRT, but your colleges are providing education to move students into either a better paying job or to move on to a 4-year degree. And I would just focus on that. It's not, they have the choice. Most of them are adults. They are choosing which courses to take. They're engaging in something that's going to benefit them. If somebody brings up a conversation that's more of a cultural war issue, try to just reframe and bring them back to the topic at hand, which is the students you're serving and the programs they need to succeed.
Thank you. Others? Or should we move to the next question?
I'll just quickly throw out, Carrie, that it's always best to talk about where you are an expert, whether you're a trustee or a president administrator, and that's your campus. And hopefully you can explain to anybody in a congressional office about the environment on your campus, the ability that students have to express views, the curriculum that is offered, and you're much better off staying on the ground and speaking directly to what your institution is doing. And I'll just add that community colleges of all the sectors of higher education is the least associated with some of the cultural issues that have proven to be so divisive in state capitals as well as here in DC.
That's a great point. Thanks, David. Next up, does the proposed Farm Bill legislation include language for streamlined accessibility to SNAP for community college students, or is that a separate ask? I think the simple answer there is yes, SNAP is part of the Farm Bill, and that's, I think, one of the appeals to working on the Farm Bill, and for why it's so bipartisan, as Jim said, is that it includes both food security, but also rural and ag-related programs. And so that's, I think, something where we're looking into what the exact details of that would be, but streamlining and considering some of the protections that were provided during the COVID emergency. Jim, anything you want to add to that?
No, Carrie, that covers it. Yes, those are definitely all part of that same legislation, not two separate things. Yeah.
And just a quick note on that, more for semantics, but than anything else. But our ask are those two items, right? It's the SNAP streamlining as well as additional support for colleges. That could look in many different ways as we move through this Congress, and especially as the Farm Bill gets reauthorized. It could be two bills that get proposed, one tackling the SNAP issue, one tackling the additional resources issue. But ultimately, this is all, they're not going to move as a standalone bill. If this is going to move, it's going to move in the SNAP legislation. So for our purposes, you're looking at those two items that you want to get included in the Farm Bill.
Thanks, Jose. Next up, we have heard there's a bill in the House that will modify the TRIO programs. It's HR 322. Do you know what the modifications will be? I will say I have not looked at this bill yet. Thank you to Rosario. She sent over the link and I just put it in the answer to this question. So you should see that typed answer. But let me ask, have any of my colleagues been able to spend any time with that bill?
No, not yet. I did a very quick view right now when Rosario shared the link. It looks like they might want to change some language around prior experience to prior success. I know this has been an ongoing issue in the TRIO spaces where it's hard for new providers to get a grant because existing TRIO grantees sort of get a leg up because they get an extra point for having that prior experience. So that might address that issue, but I'll be honest, that was like the first section of the bill that I got to. We'd have to review it a little bit more and take a look at it. It's also worth noting programs like TRIO and programs like many of the ones that we care about get different bills introduced throughout the year, throughout every Congress, every year. Some of these bills are just introduced for messaging purposes and die out. Others get a little bit more traction. So it's always worth looking at how many members are supporting the bill, who is supporting the bill, and who is talking about it, because it might just die out. But we'll take a look at the bill and see if there's anything worthwhile sharing in there.
Thanks, Jose. We have about 3 minutes left. So let's see if we can do these rapid fire. Can you please go over again the chances of getting support for workforce Pell Grants and short-term programs? This remains a top priority. Do any of my colleagues want to do odds on the chances for this Congress?
Jim, you can go. I saw you on
I
mute.
won't venture to put odds on it. We do remain more optimistic here than in other areas due to the broad bipartisan support it has. There are issues that need to be ironed out before it can really kind of move forward to getting down into some of the more detailed issues. And of course, as you know, as we talked about, we have a split Congress now, which doesn't streamline things either. But you know, in the last Congress, the Jobs Act, which is the legislation, the primary legislation that would enable us, had a majority of the Senate as co-sponsors. So, you know, for that reason and others, we have some more optimism, but I never do odds.
Thanks, Jim. What is ACT and AACC's present position on a pathway to citizenship for undocumented students? Rapid fire, we do support the DREAM Act, so that is that does provide a pathway to citizenship. I think probably we're more likely to be able to focus on Title IV access rather than the ins and outs of immigration, but do support that for our students. There's a question about addressing efforts to support job training in competition with MOOCs and private industry. I think this is probably a longer, more complicated conversation, but I would say at the least, this is one of the reasons why Workforce Pell is so very important. And then finally, does the Farm Bill provide specific funding for ag programs? So one of the pieces that we're looking at in the Farm Bill is the fact that land-grant colleges receive research funding, but there is not funding for community colleges who are working in rural or ag-supported programs. So that's something that there are a couple of rural community college-based coalitions working to expand. So we are right at the hour. I think there one more slide of reminders, Jose. And while Jose is bringing that up, I see a chat. Any advice for students attending the summit? I think for students, it's lean in, talk to as many folks as possible. Make sure they go to the student-specific session. Phi Theta Kappa has a really great advocacy training plan for them. And then we have a student trustees advisory committee meeting that will include a guest speaker, a Hill staffer, who is a former student trustee. So I think we've tried to build some student-specific programming, but also just encourage them to take part in everything possible and to speak up in meetings. I think we all know that lawmakers are always most excited to hear from them. All right, so reminders, if you haven't registered yet, please do so we can have our head counts right. The link is there. Additional resources, which we will be adding to over the next couple of days, is available. We will share these slides, which have the links on them, but generally everything is available at nls.acct.org. If you do, as I know, you will all do Hill meetings. It's very helpful for us if you fill out the congressional contact form so that we know when we go to offices whether or not there has been a recent ACCT member visit. And if you have questions generally about NLS or any of the positions, you can contact us at publicpolicy@acct.org. Thank you so much for an extra minute of your time. Thank you to my colleagues for assembling all this great information and joining me today to share it with you. And we are all very excited to see you here in person in a few short weeks. Thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.